post-conflict urban recovery in Ukraine. It's organized by the TU Delft, but very importantly in collaboration with UN, the Ukrainian urban network, the RMIT in Australia, that University in the Netherlands, and our Ukrainian partners. So my name is Caroline Newton. I'm an associate professor of spatial planning and strategy at Delft University of Technology. I'm a very close colleague of Roberto. My work and research focuses on socio-spatial dimensions of design and critical spatial practices in Europe and all over the world, or I focus, of course, on particular areas. And my interests are specifically centered on this relation between social processes and the built environment. And as I said, together with Roberto Rocco, I'm happy to facilitate this course. And the course will seek to discuss spatial strategies for an integrated urban recovery in post-conflict settings, investigating the process of reconstruction and what the notion of building back better implies, tackling inequalities, strengthening the capacities of local actors, and pursuing a green, resilient, and inclusive urban recovery anchored in sound spatial planning, design, and policy. It focuses on practical tools of spatial planning and strategy making, land policy, building and planning standards for climate adaptation and circularity, policies and programs for ensuring the development of adequate rehousing, as well as mechanisms to ensuring fairness, participation, and transparency throughout the urban recovery and reconstruction phase. Now, in the development phase of this course, we wanted to use the term post-conflict as an open term that allows us to converse with colleagues not only from the Ukraine, but also from other areas affected by conflict and violent shocks. However, it is important to acknowledge that language has been used as a tool for disinformation and the erosion of public debate, and we want to fully acknowledge that what is going on in the Ukraine at the moment is a full, senseless, and tragic war, perpetrated by a madman on a fully sovereign state. And while the war is not over yet, we want to salute our friends and colleagues from the Ukraine who bravely bear the brunt of this war and whom we wish to wholeheartedly support. All instructors in this course are working voluntarily as a service to the reconstruction of Ukraine and in support of our Ukrainian friends and colleagues. Today, with us, apart from our speakers, today with us are our speakers, Dr. Mittul Vahanvati from RMIT Melbourne and Galyna Sykhomud. Apologies if I pronounce your names not very correctly, but also with us is Pavlo Korokovsky, architect and advisor to the Dutch Board of the Government Advisors and a UN core team member. So before I introduce our speakers, I give Pavlo the word. Pavlo, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining. My name is Pavlo Korokovsky. I'm a Ukrainian architect and an advisor to the Dutch Board of Government Advisors here in the Netherlands. So I'm here to present UN, a platform which initiated and co-organized this course, Tools for Post-War Urban Recovery Ukraine. So this is our second lecture, and since last Monday, we got more than 100 new participants for the course. So yeah, I was asked to say a few words about our organization again. Sorry for those who already heard about this. But Ukraine, the Netherlands Urban Network is a platform for Ukrainian and Dutch spatial professionals who have joined forces to gain and exchange knowledge and build capacity in the context of the reconstruction of Ukraine. We are opening discussions, organizing lectures, courses, symposiums, and different studio visits. You can see all our past and future events on our website, un.nu. Through this website, you can also register and join meetings you would like to join the future, of course. So UN is striving for a modern, sustainable and flourishing Ukraine as a part of European Union. So we seek to cooperate with the best practices and universities in the world. And proudly want to say that TU Delft is one of them. Except of TU Delft, we also partners with the Amsterdam Academy van Bouwkunst, Independent School for the City, Rotterdam Academy van Bouwkunst, Het New Institute, Air Rotterdam, and HS and some others. The course, Tools for Post-War Urban Recovery Ukraine, will examine lessons from previous approaches to reconstruction, such as the Marshall Plan. We will discuss the different roles of diverse stakeholders and explore possible spatial strategies for integrated urban recovery. During these 8 lectures, you will meet a number of practitioners, academics, researchers, and architects. And I want to say thank you to everybody for doing this and for joining us. It is also my honor to thank people without whom this course would not have happened. You can see all of them on the screen right now, I guess. So it's Roberto Rocco, an associate professor of spatial planning and strategy at the Department of Urbanism at Bouwkunde at TU Delft. Dr. Caroline Newton, who just started this lecture, an associate professor and Van Ersten Fellow at the Department of Urbanism at the Faculty of Architecture and Built Environment at TU Delft. And Julia Lawson, our previous speaker from the last session, but she's also joining us today, as she said, as a student, an adjunct professor of CUR and international urban and housing researcher at RMIT University, a lead author of the UN report, Housing 2030 by UNICEF, Inhabited and Housing Europe, and co-author of the report, The Building Place to Call Home, published recently by PBL. Thanks a lot. I'm now giving the floor back to Caroline, who will introduce our first speaker. Thank you once again and good luck.
Thank you, Pavlo. And indeed, today with us, we have Dr. Mittul Vahanvati. She's a lecturer at the Center for Urban Research at RMIT University, and she will talk to us about community-led self-recovery. Dr. Vahanvati is a lecturer in sustainability and urban planning at RMIT, and her research focuses on informal settlements, vulnerable communities, and striving to have a real-world impact. She engages with UN bodies, including UN Habitat, UNEP, UNFCCC, national and local governments in Australia and the Pacific, as well as non-governmental organizations. She is one of the lead members in a large multidisciplinary action research project titled Climate Resilient Honiara, and that already since 2018. It's funded by UNFCCC Adaptation Fund and administered by UN Habitat. At RMIT, Dr. Vahanvati leads the design and development of a suite of urban design courses core to the Planning Institute of Australia's accreditation. This lecture was developed collaboratively with Galyna Sykhomud. She's a research associate at the Institute for European Urban Studies at the Bauhaus University in Weimar in Germany, and a member of the NGO New Housing Policy in Kiev, Ukraine. Galyna is also a coordinator of the working group Crisis, Conflict and Recovery at the European Network for Housing Research. So before I give you the floor, I just want to point out to all the attendees today that if you have any questions about the certificates, please send an email, contact us via the website. We have very little time to address these issues. So without further ado, I would now like to give the floor to Dr. Vahanvati and to Galyna Sykhomud. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mittul Vahanvati, and as Carolina has kindly given a really good introduction, I won't dwell on that part. I'll just first share my screen, and can you see full screen? It's not the presenter view, yeah?
No, it's the full screen.
Okay, thank you. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about what does a community-led or self-led housing recovery look like? And before I go into it, I would like to first acknowledge the Bunburung and Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation who are the traditional custodians of the unceded land on which I live, teach, and learn. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to know where everyone is joining us today from. And Roberto has organized a Mentimeter. So if we can just maybe enter that in.
One second, I need to shift. In order to use the Mentimeter now, we have to, I have to share my screen.
Yes. So while Roberto is organizing the screen, I would like to quickly give you a brief overview of what we'll be covering today. First, we'll go through just a quick overview of a few concepts in the field of disasters and crisis. What does adequate housing mean? What does vulnerability mean? When does a natural hazard or a human-created crisis become disastrous? And the opposite of disastrous is human well-being. So how can we go from the state of disaster or disruption to a state of well-being? And that is the process of recovery, which is also termed as Build Back Better, which is the highlight of today's presentation. Over to you, Roberto.
Yes, it generally takes a little time for everybody to log in and enter their countries, but we are seeing quite a lot of people from Germany and the Ukraine, India. Generally, our Indian friends are really interested in this topic. The Netherlands, of course, Brussels, Kharkiv. So my suggestion is that you now share your screen and we go back to this while people answer. Okay,
that's fine. All right, so I'll continue, yeah? Okay, thanks for giving a quick overview, Roberto. Okay, so we'll start with housing, and potentially Julie would have covered this last week. But this definition of adequate housing took a long time to be developed by the UN. And what does adequacy mean? And by 1948, housing was determined as one of the basic human rights, that everyone has a right to an adequate house. But what does it mean? Now it has also made it in SDG target 11.1. To me, to simplify this diagram, it can mean that adequate housing is comprised of three key ingredients. One is freedom. Freedom in terms of where you want to locate it, to express your cultural needs through the housing, and to meet your accessibility needs, as in proximity to your work or your family, whatever that freedom requires. Second is entitlement, to have a secure land tenure, have availability of water and services, and non-discriminatory as well. And the third thing is meet minimum requirements for the house to be habitable. And whatever those minimum standards are for habitability need to be determined by its occupants. And the diagram on the right is basic attributes of adequate housing. Again, at the very bottom of it, though it's small, it is land, access to land and security of land, on the basis of which a durable house can be built, on which there could be services provided, sufficient living conditions that can happen as well. Excuse me. Excuse me. So, however, housing is at risk from climate change induced hazards, and they all can be categorized under hydrological, meteorological, and there's various typology of natural hazards. As you can see on the graph, on the image on the right, the impact of hazards from 1980 to 1999 was quite different, and the bubble has swelled comparatively from 2000 to 2019. And these impacts are reported in terms of the number of occurrence, total death of population, affected people, as in those who got injured, had to be hospitalized or whatever, and economic loss. On the left is the impact due to climatic hazards. And as you can see, the red line, red bar, is that of high-income countries. While the occurrence of hazards was only 27% in high-income country, they took a much higher share of economic loss. On the contrary, the countries with low and middle income, the light green one, had nearly similar amount of hazard occurrence, 29%, but they took much larger share of death, nearly 50% of death. And so why is that the case? One factor could be the inflated reporting from developed countries versus underreporting from other income groups. However, the other reason is lower poor quality housing, much smaller housing types in the lower economic group, which has lower economic impact. Yeah. So in developed countries, the housing type, material construction is much more complex and of more economic value, and that may also contribute to higher economic loss. So roughly, as per this CREED, which is the global data collection for hazards of any type, man-made, which is wars and crisis, as well as technological, such as the nuclear reactor or any industrial area catching fire. They all hazard types combined, an average of the number of people affected in developing countries equate to 7 times more those who are impacted in developed countries, even when they are exposed to similar magnitude of natural hazard. So here we are talking about crisis, and I was trying to find some information on crisis and its impact over time, like the way there is this disaster impact chart. However, there is no such data that has been gathered for 2022 and 2023, which is when the Ukraine impact data would be around. So I could not present that, and hence these charts. So how, based on the explanation before, when does a hazard become a disaster or a crisis becomes destructive? It happens at the intersection of hazard, which is on the dark blue side, which is beyond the control of humans when it is hazard, but when it is man-made or like a crisis, it is not beyond the control of humans. And vulnerability as well as exposure. So vulnerability is human sensitivity or the sensitivity of the built environment, whereas exposure is you coming in the way of the hazard. So for example, those who were located along the border in close proximity to Russia were at high exposure compared to those who were further away. So they were, by the mere factor of where they were located, they were highly exposed to impact. So these three are the intersecting issues where risk occurs. And what we can control is vulnerability and exposure. Sometimes hazard is just beyond our control. And so when it comes to built environment and housing, this is the pressure and release model, where the pressures are built by hazard or conflict and these vulnerable situations. So when they two meet each other, that's when disaster occurs. To give you an example, when I explain to my little young children, I tell them that if there was a massive earthquake in a deserted place, would you call it a disaster or just call it an earthquake? And they, without them having any knowledge about disasters and hazard difference, they say, oh, that's an earthquake. And I said, if it were to happen in Melbourne and lots of buildings crumble or collapse, a lot of people get injured, what would you call it? A disaster. So that's what I mean, that when people, the society gets in the way of a hazard, that's the intersection at which a disaster happens. So, and lots of researchers have worked on it. And this pressure and release model says that don't just look at vulnerability at the face of it. For example, right now, the impact we calculate in terms of this much economic impact has occurred in Ukraine. This many homes have been destroyed. But when you ask why that has happened, you start going to the bottom of the root cause of why that problem happens. For example, in Turkey, the house collapse was due to the political aspects of government allowing builders to build poor quality houses to meet the housing demand. So they met the short-term needs at the cost of longer-term issues. So almost always the root cause of disaster occurrence or the risk creation is due to socioeconomic or political reasons. And that's why we say that vulnerability is often rooted in socioeconomic and political processes. This is the definition of a disaster as per the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Authority. And You can read that. I won't read that aloud, but it's actually basically a function when these three come together. So how do we move from a disaster situation towards a better and brighter future, or a future that everyone desires? So there are three different pathways that one could end up in. And they're called, if there is resistance in the system post-crisis, you would end up essentially functioning at pre-hazard level or conditions. When there is a crisis, depending on the severity of the hazard, there would be resource that would be mobilized. Depending on the robustness and rapidity of resource mobilization, there might be temporary time period of dysfunction. But depending on the resource type, one could either rebuild the same sort of housing, for example, as there was before the crisis, and hence there would be persistent dysfunction or vulnerability would persist, or you could improvise and leapfrog to a resilient future trajectory where there would be an altered planning and housing design, and which would be adapted to the future. Yeah. So this has been developed by Norris, which also has been adopted by the International Federation for Red Cross. And this is the most important framework that has been developed for recovery. And during my PhD research, and since then for the last 10 years, I have been looking at pathways and processes which could enable housing recovery to lead to this resilience trajectory. So what actually happens after a disaster is that UN agencies, predominantly from all these different sectors, they become active from within 24 hours of a crisis. But in the context of war, it's very different, because there is no start and end date. There may be a starting time, but there is no end time. It keeps rolling on for a while. The only other natural hazard that I could think of, which had similar effect, was the multiple earthquake sequences in New Zealand, where people didn't know when the next earthquake would strike or when it will ever end, because there were more than 7 sequences. So that makes it very complex, and hence people who are trained in being in conflict situation are the ones who are on the ground helping everyone. So in case of Ukraine, I was searching, there's Ukrainian Red Cross, there's UN Economic Commission for Europe, UN OCHR, and UNHCR. They are usually active. In context of shelter, it is UNHCR. They mainly work with forcibly displaced communities and refugees in helping them finding a place which is safe to live. So before I progress to the next stage of what happens after the immediate emergency phase, I'd like you to think about what processes dominate during housing recovery. Excuse me. It's me. Okay. So who is involved in housing recovery, as in who are the key decision maker, what processes happen, and what resources go into making this recovery possible. So if you remember the diagram I showed you before, it was about resources, it was about who the actors are, and who the decision makers are who decide which trajectory housing recovery goes into. And it's a different thing to think about a trajectory you want, but what processes actually make it happen. So maybe if Roberto, do we have Mentimeter now active where everyone can put answers to this?
Yes, it's available. If people go to view options, they can select the shared screen of Roberto.
Roberto? Hello?
Yes, Mittul, you can, everyone can sort of, in view options on the top, you can select his shared screen. So there are two shared screens. Oh, Roberto, now it's gone. Now it's back. People can select either your screen or Roberto's screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the answers are coming in.
Oh, okay. Did
Finance, one very interesting one, courage, gaming professionals, financial institutions, relocation, financial distribution. We can go on. Mittul, you have to tell me when you want to go back to your presentation.
Yeah, I can't see it.
But that's probably because you're also the person who is sharing a screen.
Oh, okay. Okay. No worries. Yeah, sorry. If you don't mind just maybe saying what processes dominate during housing recovery?
Yeah, the one that is winning, so to speak, is funding. The other is finance, which I guess is practically the same. Some people are saying courage, community, professionals, the degree of the destruction. I think community is very interesting for this lecture. Demographic evaluations, the remaining population, finding housing locations, community involvement, demographic evaluation of political will. Of course, a lot of people mention that. Design, participation, and so on.
Fantastic. Thank you. Wow. Okay, this is pretty good. All right, so let's look at what research suggests. So what is the process involved in housing recovery? First is assessment and preparation or planning. Second is the whole program design, and then the implementation approach. So when I say assessment, there are multiple assessments that happen. One is a broad brush needs assessment in terms of what is the impact of the conflict or hazard, number of people injured or dead, or houses damaged or lost. So it's a broad brush, big picture. What is the need in terms of medicine, food, water, clothing, etc., etc. But then there is sectoral assessment, which is detailed. And as I showed in the previous diagram, these are the different sectors that UN has established, and they call it the UN cluster system, which each cluster has to coordinate with the other cluster. And so shelter is one of the cluster, water, sanitation, and hygiene is another. So each cluster specific group will do detailed sectoral assessment of what is the need in their particular sector. And one important one is also logistics and health. So those sectoral assessments are also done before the program is designed, but this whole assessment is to understand how big is the damage, what is the scope of work that requires, and who will manage. So who will be the key actors who will manage it and who will be the beneficiary. So there is some data already emerging in context of Ukraine. Then comes the program delivery, and program would be for, say, infrastructure recovery or housing recovery, health and livelihood recovery. So those are the different programs then that emerges out of this big picture assessment. So when it comes to housing recovery, many of you have already said where to locate the house, types of housing. Do we have an ample building code that could help with building homes for the future, not for the present, but for the future? What is the sort of money or even technical skills or material assistance that people would require? So that's why I prefer calling it assistance package rather than finance package, because assistance can be social, technical, psychosocial, as well as material, provision of material. And what is the way in which it will be dispersed? Will it be given to beneficiaries in first go or multiple tranches? And lastly comes, so this program design is usually done at the state level. The assessment and bringing the international funding or is done at the federal or national scale. And when it comes to implementation, it is usually the state government partnering with the local government as well as NGO sector. And that's where the implementation happens. And this is where I will, number 2 and 3 is where I'll focus today's discussion on. So implementation has either been done in a top-down manner, whereby the government employs contractors or builders and says, here's the money, build this, and it is very top-down. It's not participatory, what you have identified as one of the needs. Location, design, material selection, none of that would have community involvement in those decision making. So if you remember the adequate housing diagram I had shown at the very start, that had freedom to choose, that freedom is gone in contractor-driven approach. Second predominant approach is self-help or owner-driven or community-led, which is where my research has mainly focused on. Okay, so recovery program design requires decision-making for all these different aspects. Where to locate house, same place, or relocation. What type of houses should be provided? Should we build straight away permanent house, or would it be temporarily people would be located somewhere else and then come back to this house because there is a lot of time required to rebuild? Is it a core house or a transitional house, multi-unit, medium density, or single unit? I'll come back to transitional house in a moment. And who gets assistance? Owners, renters, social housing people, and how much support each one gets. Do they get all the same amount, different amount? How do we determine that? And what will be the mechanisms for disbursement? Via banks, material voucher, via contractors, how? and who will build the house, and who will monitor and evaluate the construction quality? So these are the questions that needs to be factored in when designing a program, which usually is developed by the state, as I said. So when it comes to housing, many a times, during emergency phase, people in developing countries are provided with tents or some kind of tarp, or majority of people usually tend to go to a local church or an evacuation center. That is predominantly for a week or a couple of weeks, after which people would want their own space and not be in a massive church. So that's when comes in the transitional or shelter. As the name suggests, it is temporary in nature, occasionally prefabricated kit-off parts home, or caravans, which is what was given in Australia. And just today, I was talking to one of the authorities, and they said one pod, like a prefabricated small temporary pod, cost 130,000 Australian dollars. And the transport of it, putting it there, attaching all the water sanitation needs with it, is all additional cost. So is that money justified for just the transitional shelter? Probably not. So instead of having temporary relief through those shelters, there has been a new approach which is called transitional shelter, where only a small core of the house is built. For example, one room, toilet, kitchen is built, but it allows for further extensions by the homeowners as time permits. And that is still permanent. It's not temporary, and it can transition into becoming permanent. And that's where it is called transitional shelter, which has pathways towards becoming permanent. So this is where my focus is, as how the reconstruction can take a resilient trajectory. And with resilient trajectory, I also mean that it prevents future disasters from occurring. So it reduces future risk. Implementation approach, as I said, contractor-driven or owner-driven, but there are variations within. And there's a third one called cash approach, where government just gives cash to residents and says, my work is done. Now it's up to you how you want to recover. So I'll provide a few examples within. Contractor-driven can be on the same site as where the house was previously, or on another site. And I'll give an example of Hurricane Katrina. Owner-driven recovery in case of India, and which has, again, variations, and I'll show cooperative-based housing because that's the most relevant to Ukraine. So what does implementation approach rely on? And you have nicely, many of you have said it relies on the severity, the demographic, political will, and a lot of other factors you've identified. I put it down to these 4 or 5, I would say. Yes, the disaster type or the disruption type and the severity of it. In context of housing, it is also the complexity of construction system. And what was the culture of building it, who built it, who designed it, even in normal times. So that is the housing culture. So participation is all good, but if you ask in Japan or China, people say, we don't want participation, we want government to provide us built housing. So if that's the culture, people don't want participation, yeah? And capacities. So what are the people's capacities in terms of taking up the extra work that requires in terms of designing and building and monitoring the house construction? Do they have the capacity to do that? And the time frame, how urgent is it, the need to have house recovered? The larger the damage or the more complex the construction system, the more likely it is for the government to employ a contractor-driven approach to housing recovery. So this case study, one is from New Zealand as well. The Canterbury earthquake sequence, which I spoke to you about earlier, led to destruction of nearly 100,000 residential houses. And 7,000 homes out of those 100,000 were in red zone, meaning that they shouldn't have been built on that land or in the first place, but they were. So government did a lot of different zonings, updated the land use risk. Red zone was a no-go zone. Orange was something that they had to see case by case based on soil samples and whatnot. And the green zone was, yes, people can rebuild there. So these 7,000 homes government had to buy back from the community. And the money the communities got, they had to find another place, a land to relocate to. So one positive thing about this, which was a top-down approach, contractor-driven approach in New Zealand, was that the government established the Earthquake Commission, a specific vehicle authority who takes care of everything to do with reconstruction and recovery. Yeah. So land use zoning, disaster insurance, land and contents insurance. So it was called Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, CERA. The government gave it unprecedented powers to bypass the authority of any existing government organization, just to expedite the building permit and expedite the process of recovery as well. But this top-down approach, command and control approach, which said communities, take your hands off. It even told the local government to take the hands off and took away their powers too, has led people feeling disenfranchised. They wanted some say in the future, in their own future, in their own housing rebuilding. The second thing was the government gave some money, some support initially in the early days, but most of the finance for housing recovery was reliant on private insurance. New Zealand has 95% insurance coverage. So 95% households had earthquake insurance. So it wasn't the case that people didn't have insurance, but the fact that such a large catastrophe and so many people seeking insurance money led to exposed insurance weakness. There were insufficient financial resources because the government said that people can claim 7 times because of 7 earthquakes that they experienced, which meant that if each individual from this 100,000 homes were to claim 7 times, it is extra work for the insurance company to go over those claims. So they had a lack of time. And the insurance claim processing was so slow, it took nearly 3 to 5 years before claims were entirely managed and resolved. So there were these 2 key problems, over-reliance on private sector to fund the recovery, and too much power to the government, which bypass the local government as well as communities, which disenfranchised them. So it was top-down command and control and capital-driven recovery. There were a few grassroots initiatives, but apart from that, it was mainly top-down. So overall, it took 7 years for the houses to be completed, with a few places recovery still ongoing even after 7 years. So the other negative aspect of contractor-driven or agency-driven approach is a lack of cultural representation. And if you once again remember the adequate housing diagram, the freedom for cultural adequacy or cultural representation through their housing, it also disappears. So that entire freedom aspect disappears. When the contractors in India in 1993 earthquake, contractors were called in, and traditional village organic settlement pattern and morphology was completely destroyed. And what you saw was a grid pattern, concrete houses, which remained vacant 10 years after. It's a ghost town. Nobody lives there. So foreign construction material, construction technology was introduced, foreign design was introduced, foreign planning was introduced, and nobody felt it related to what they stood for. It was culturally and climatically inappropriate, as well as people didn't have the skills to keep it, to maintain it. So this suggests importance of socio-cultural as well as political dynamics. So from New Zealand case, it was the political and capitalist dynamics of a neoliberal society, versus in case of India, it was more about that socio-cultural underpinnings that were missing. So those two dynamics are what people crave for in the long-term recovery. So when we come to a complete opposite end of supported self-recovery process, it refers to the process whereby crisis-affected households recover their living space reliant on their own resources and capabilities without formal assistance. So that is the complete other end of top-down. However, so in the humanitarian sector, it is a known fact that about 80 to 90% of disaster or crisis affected people do recover on their own without any external support. And hence this approach is a way of acknowledging that this would happen irrespective of us wanting it or not. But the in-between of the two is the assisted self-recovery or supported self-recovery, whereby there is a cushion or a buffer or support system provided to enable people to have their freedoms, but also ensuring that the longer-term view, which individuals may not see right now, is provided by the governance system. So additional support is provided to the people, and that support or assistance depends on what is needed. And the three key building blocks of assisted self-recovery are context analysis, which is what I was telling, that there is an assessment required and understanding the context is essential. And when they say context analysis, they also see what is the local culture, people's strengths, skills, capabilities, and what are the barriers to self-recovery. Second is facilitation and accompaniment to fill the capacity deficits or capacity gaps, not to come in saying we are the saviors and here we are to help you, but this is to say that you are already skilled and capable in these areas. These are the gap areas, and so we'll just come in to fill that gap. And third is community engagement and mobilization to foster their agency, their choice, and their empowerment for the future. So there's a source guide, a self-recovery guidance that you can find on the Global Shelter Cluster. It is free to download. And there's much more information in there, but the snapshot of it is that it would work when people have land rights. So this approach does not work when people people living in informal settlements. Yeah, they need additional assistance to get land rights before you can assist them with self-recovery. They need to have the skills to build themselves or have the finance to hire labor. It doesn't work when there is, or it could work when there is poor accessibility. And there are capacities within the communities, and the political realities are such that there is strong hierarchy. That's when people do tend to do their own thing, and when there is time pressure. So similarly, in the humanitarian world, the International Federation for Red Cross came up with this similar term, which is called owner-driven housing reconstruction. And this is not new at all. Self-help housing, self-led recovery has been existing for eons, like in indigenous cultures around the world. This is the working definition I had come up with before, because there is no agreed definition around. It is just being understood as an approach. So this, again, is appropriate during the processes that I have mentioned here, which is fairly similar to assisted self-help approach. But I'd like to clarify something about this approach, because there are many misconceptions or misunderstandings around it. When we say owner-driven, it doesn't necessarily mean that only owners or landowners can take this approach. It means that the households have ownership of the process. So that's what this means. Owner-driven doesn't mean you have to do everything by yourself or do it yourself. That is another misconception. It is always assisted. It is also perceived to be demeaning or devolving nation states' responsibilities onto the civil society or NGOs or communities. Again, that's incorrect, because governments have to go out of their way to ensure they create the enabling environment, develop partnerships, coordinate all the efforts to ensure that everyone has a say in the process. So these are the few misconceptions which have led to thinking that self-led recovery means self-recovery. No, you are the ultimate decision maker. You have the freedom to choose. You have the agency to choose what you want, but you are also provided assistance for where you need it. Okay, so this is example from New Orleans in USA. Broadmoor area was highly impacted. 90% of homes were damaged, causing $125 billion US dollars worth of damage. So what did the government do is the Federal Emergency Management Agency was already existing. It was set up as a decentralized governance. It wasn't top-down. It dedicated key responsibilities to each different authorities that existed. Collectively, there was a community-based association developed to negotiate and navigate the complex housing rebuilding process. So this is sort of an in-between of cooperative and housing recovery, because this group, community-based association, became like a conduit between FEMA and the communities. Another positive of this was that the insurance, which in the case of New Zealand was completely like a standalone private sector, here NFIP, the disaster recovery funding, so National Flood Insurance Program, was established as a public-private partnership between the Congress and the insurance company. And so each participant would get $250,000 for home building, and people could put in extra to build their home. So in that sense, it was really, the governance system was well established, the finance system was well established, and it was all decentralized. But then the only missing link was that community participation wasn't really well thought out. And the communities were involved as tokenistically. They were not involved in assessment of what was needed, and in terms of finance, buyout claims, and planning as to what should be rebuilt. So the planning itself took 10 years, which caused excessive planning fatigue. Before planning is done as to where the roads are, where the services are, if the land block size will reduce, whether they're allowed to rebuild, all that planning issues took 10 years. So until then, people could not rebuild their houses. So here the issue was the planning and lack of people's involvement. If they would have been involved through that community group, the planning would have been resolved much earlier. So there was a disconnect there. So everyone thought that after the financial resources, the second dominant process was the implementation and management of governance. For example, the planning, the building permit, construction, inspection, which was not done adequately well. So this last example is from India, and that showcases cooperative as well as cooperative model is appropriate when there is multi-residential apartments, whereas owner-driven may be, cooperative is a subset of owner-driven, but owner-driven could be when it's driven by one or two households, yeah? So in Gujarat in 2001, there was a massive earthquake, which was second most deadliest earthquake recorded in history. And it destroyed 1 million houses, which is, again, a massive number, 20,000 deaths. And in the commercial capital, Gujarat, that I'm going to talk about, which had population of 5.6 million, nearly 50 multi-story apartments were destroyed. The count of single-story houses or medium density houses was much higher, in total 1 million. So the earthquake had also hit at a time when the state had not yet fully recovered from previous 2 years of drought. So for the poor, And those farmers or those reliant on subsistence means recovery was just not feasible without assistance. And that's where an owner-driven approach. So the only negative of cooperative is that it can, I'm saying potentially, it may not be suitable for post-conflict communities, because cooperative requires communities to mobilize and group together. So we just need to work on that. So during my PhD, I had looked at 2 different states, which were 7 years, which had disasters 7 years apart, but followed 2 NGOs and their work as well as policies by the government, which were again 7 years apart. And I have visited those places every 7 years. So I've visited those places 3 times already, and I've been doing longitudinal study. So in case of Gujarat, so 2001 Gujarat earthquake and 2008 Bihar Koshi flood is what I had compared and assessed. So the key positives are there's a dedicated authority, and that authority doesn't see themselves as command and control, but they see themselves as enablers. So there's a political will to create an enabling environment. Second is the program design. The program is designed to be owner-driven, and India was one of the first, one of the 2 countries who adopted owner-driven at scale. So rebuilding 1 million homes in a time frame of 3 years is phenomenal. So the government claimed to have built over 200,000 homes and repaired over 900,000 houses in a phenomenal 2 years time frame, winning the prestigious UN Sasakawa Award and the Commonwealth Award for disaster resilient recovery. The funding, they established a fund by which each households would be given money from the government. And I'll tell you why the government had to give all the money. The government did systematic context analysis and took loan from multilateral agencies as well as World Bank and the Asia Development Bank to provide communities with money. And this is the framework I came up with as to the essential ingredients in a process of recovery for it to take a resilient trajectory. The first arm is systems analysis, which is context to develop a contextual reconstruction program, social processes to build community trust and mobilize them, technical processes for, as in planning, construction material, building code, and continued capacity building. So there were different approaches taken by different NGOs on the ground. Though the policy, at program level, it said owner-driven reconstruction. Government allowed NGOs to adopt a village or adopt a community living in an apartment and give them assistance, material, financial, technical, whatever assistance necessary to build that, but they need to sign in with the government to let them know so the communities don't get funding twice. So why the government had to do that is because vast majority of people in India didn't have insurance. The General Insurance Corporation, which is state-owned monopoly on non-life insurance or property insurance, had put in a caveat in their insurance saying for earthquake or fire, people would have to have additional top-up insurance. And if people said they didn't want that additional thing, the insurance companies would even give them 30% discount on insurance premiums. So there was a massive review of insurance after this earthquake. But as you can see in the middle, the apartment here is Mansi building, complex building, where the building broke in two parts where the staircases were, and few of their blocks collapsed. Potentially 1 or 2 blocks survived. And this is the complex now. So for this complex, the government had set up a team of engineers, architects, government officials, social worker, and a student from architecture college, which is when I was a student. And I went from house to house at that time, noting down what the structural engineer, the architect, and social worker told me. That was then translated into a massive system which helped categorize the damage level of each house, the damage to lives or limbs of people living in it. And based on those categorization, people got money from the government. The government money had to be topped up by the people and by the NGO, at least 50% by government and 50% by the NGO or community in form of labor, material, or cash. And government kept a transparent, not very transparent, but kept a massive record keeping of this funding to ensure that no double up happens. Some apartment dwellers went as lucky to get the money. These apartment dwellers, Sangemarmar and Shikhar, where one of them was only 10 years old and yet completely collapsed. So the residents of Shikhar Housing Society, the image of which you can see on the left, they decided, usually they have a body corp or a small group of residents have a little committee. So they decided to do something about it. They got an architect who developed the building drawings as per the latest seismic zoning, earthquake zoning for the area. Good construction quality, got it costed, and they determined each one has to contribute how much. So 40 households in one tower. Not everyone agreed initially to pay the money because they just didn't have it. They borrowed it from their relatives overseas or whichever way, because government money was just not enough and they didn't get any NGO support. So after quite a few years, they managed to rebuild their house, and collectively, they also complained to the State Consumer Disputes Addressal Commission to dispute against the builder who had built their housing, and say that they had compromised on the construction quality and the materials. And 11 years after, because it was a collective voice, they won the case, and each resident has been reimbursed the money they had spent, plus the interest of all these years of that on that money. So it's one of the success stories where if people living in the apartment wants to rebuild, they need to basically come together. So given the time, I'll go through quickly about the key ingredients of success. So this was a chart made as to systems design, systems analysis for program design. The goal, what is the goal of that? what is the value deliverables and what activities or processes helped achieve that. So when they did context analysis, they also determined what were the deep-rooted systemic issues causing vulnerability and address them at the same time as rebuilding. For example, there were no building codes up to that seismic level 4 in Gujarat, which were introduced and enforced. The governance system in 2001 was very top-down, but when it came to implementation on the ground, there were multiple different approaches adopted by different agencies. And I don't have time to go into this right now, but there's a paper I've written on it about how the project implementation relied on the goodwill of NGOs. Some NGOs jumped from one project to the other to the third. So from housing to capacity building to livelihood, economic development. And those communities are thriving right now. But there were many who would just finish the project and move on to somewhere else, closed loop projects. Whereas in 2008, the government worked alongside NGOs and the communities to develop the program. They trialed in one settlement and improvised it and then worked on, then scaled up. So this agile approach is not seen anywhere in the world. This is one of the very few examples. The NGO
Mittul, I just wanted to draw your attention to the time because we are really close to the end.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the last one, which is capacity building, which is very important. So it's not just the capital, but also capacities and capabilities, which is very important when developing a recovery program. And I'll jump straight to Ukraine here, so Galyna can speak to it. So what are the lessons for Ukraine in this? There's already been plan assessment done for Ukraine as to where the damage has occurred, how many are internally displaced, how many are refugees, what is the need for housing and finance or the economic recovery, because these are the sort of exports Ukraine was reliant on for the economy. So economists are saying that this war has reversed 15 years of development progress done by Ukraine, and 7.1 million people are pushed into poverty because of this. So the areas spatially, which are 10 most affected regions from the destruction and damage, are the darker blue shades that you see. And these are the categorization of damage, the assessment that I told you. And as you can see, the cost of recovery would equate to 2.6 times the country's GDP from 2022. And after transport, housing is the biggest in terms of need for recovery. And yeah, so given this assessment, what is the sort of program that needs to be designed and implemented for Ukraine? Galyna, over to you here.
Yes, thank you very much, Mittul, for this wonderful presentation. And I believe we all have a lot of things to think about and reflect on Ukrainian case. Of course, not all things are directly transferable, but I found some examples which might be interesting for the audience, how these approaches are working in Ukraine. Basically, the damage currently is enormous. So in terms of comparison, we can compare it to the damage of the World War II in Europe. So I think in comparison with the cases we heard, it's just such a different scale. So we should aware that one approach or one tool in planning and housing recovery might not be enough to solve this issue, but the different processes mentioned in this lecture have place in Ukraine right now, and they surely will play a significant role in the future. So as an example for our audience, I would like to also talk about the program started recently with our government. It's called the Відновлення. It's something which can be translated, there is recovery, and this E stays for electronic, I guess, because it's all very digital and people can apply through our digital platform DIA. And its idea of it is very close to this assisted self-recovery, owner-driven approach in Ukraine. So basically, the government through the system, people can apply for damage to get a compensation, or get not a compensation, but rather to get a sum up to approximately 5,000 euro for restoration of what is important, partly damaged houses. So this is applied only for houses which damage is like quite low, so they can be easily repaired with like repairing doors, windows, and not like very big construction damage. And it's currently, this program is funded from Fund for Liquidation of the Consequences of Aggression, of Russian aggression. And currently for this program, we dedicated 4.4 billion Ukrainian hryvnias. And basically in this program's priority given for war veterans, family of the fallen soldiers, mobilized people with disabilities, but for all other categories, it's first come for third approach. And those only people could apply for compensation which are located on the government controlled territories, and also only people could apply who still have not repaired their own housing, or in case if they repaired their own housing but they had not finished it. So because with this money they could only use it on special bank card to buy only like some special services and construction materials. And we could see that in the first week of this program already like 10,000 or more than 10,000 people apply, and you can see on this map in different regions in Ukraine. The next slide, please. Yeah, but I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of points in regard of this program and in general, I guess, assisted self-recovery in Ukraine. And of course, there are major benefits of this program because in many cases it enables the return home, and returning home, like it's the biggest wish for many people in Ukraine, of course, and it amplifies existing resources we have. So repairing houses which are not significantly damaged, of course, costs less than it would be building new somewhere else, and also it's kind of respects property rights and restores them because part of this fund from which money are coming to this program, they also confiscated assets of Russian state in Ukraine or companies that belong to Russia, I guess. So it's kind of also connected to this question of justice in this case. But I also would like to say that there are many risks connected to this approach, as currently we don't have so many other programs in recovery finance for people, given to people. And we have 1.4 million unit damage or destroyed, and like third part of them are completely destroyed. And through this program, currently only relatively small amount of units can be financed by this program. So basically, I think if everyone gets 5,000 euro, it's something like around 22,000 units can be repaired. And if we see how big is damage, so it's not that much. And it's also one can imagine it's difficult to scale it up because of pure cost. How much does it cost to repair this unit? And also such programs, and I will finish soon. Such programs, even though they are very desirable for people who want to return home, they don't resolve many problems with urban planning and housing in Ukraine regarding maintenance, for instance. So basically, it's very high cost, but very little improvement in terms of sustainability, living environment. And it has a lot of issues, unresolved issues. How do you repair these units when couple owners claim and start reparations, but other units in multi-unit apartment houses are not restored? So there are a lot of questions to be answered with this program. And also with like restoration of individual units not always means the restoration of communities, or restoration of some housing unit does not mean the return of the person, or does not mean that all community returns. So this, in this case, the self-assisted self-recovery also ignores this all sustainability planning community issue, but at the same time, it requires high cost to implement. And further, and we can also in Ukraine, maybe you could also visit websites when you get presentation. A lot of other examples were not government assisted, but rather NGO-led, civil society-led housing in recovery in Ukraine. And you can check a lot of very like efficient project of using finance. So for instance, Kohate is the project initiated by NGO Metal Up in Western Ukraine in Ivano-Frankivsk, and they renovate housing of different ownership types to repurpose them for the usage of temporary displaced people. Mostly the housing units would provide housing for 80 to 250 people, I guess. And for instance, their pilot project, it cost only 38,000 euro, and it was done by local activists and volunteers in only 6 weeks to provide housing. Yeah, you can go further, and you can look. There are many different initiatives from rubble cleaning to reconstruction around Ukraine. Yeah, you can check them later. And just the last slide. And also, yeah, if we look closer on this NGO-led, civil society-led housing, it has also a lot of potential for Ukraine, because it works not only on individual restoration, but it works with community restoration, rebuilding or healing of social ties, and creation of the new social ties, which also helps with trauma healing and overcoming war trauma. It also amplifies a lot existing resources. It's much cheaper than all commercial variants proposed, and it creates a space for architectural urban experimentation, because it's often not like self-led by people, but it's led by some group of activists who have some expertise and could create pilot project or housing solutions. But it has many similar risks that it's small scale. It's difficult to scale up on bigger picture, and it's also not a comprehensive housing or planning solution, and it has a lot of unclear access mechanisms for target groups who would be who's got help from this NGO, or who gets access to this housing unit, as we have like 5 million people of the displaced, and only maybe 1,000 of them would live in this beautiful project with a lot of architectural experimentation. So it's not clear how these goods are distributed between people, of course. So it's a lot of questions to think, but in general, I believe both this assisted owner-led recovery, civil society, NGO-led recovery, housing recovery. These processes, they already exist in Ukraine. They will be part of bigger scale of recovery. But what's important, how they will all build up in one system, which answers where different group of people with different socioeconomic needs, vulnerabilities will live. And it's not a patchwork approach for people who first come, first served in this scale. Yes, thank you very much for being able to also give this feedback. I think it's important to to connect different cases through space and time and see what the possibilities there.
Fabulous. Thank you, Galyna. So I'll just come back to this last questions. If you were to answer this as part of your assignment or on Mentimeter, that would be great, because this is again to reflect that Ukraine has 90% home ownership, but people have lost everything they had. So they don't have that financial buffer or documents to prove their land rights. Some even don't want to come back, maybe. So there is very different situation there. And hence the housing recovery process, what can actually not just rebuild physical housing, but also communities, as it requires participation, requires people to be able to make the decision, but not have to actually build their own house. And remember, recovery is building back what was there before war. But resilient recovery is all about meeting the sustainability, inclusion, and climate change adaptation needs of the future. So we are not talking about just the recovery, but we are talking about leapfrogging that to a better future. So these are the three questions. What capacities do communities have? What capabilities do government have to create an enabling environment? Because to scale up, it has to come from the government to allow NGOs and communities and government to work together, as well as private sector to contribute. And what would be few different housing approaches that would best suit Ukraine. So this becomes your assignment if you are intending to do one. And thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mittul and Galyna, for a very interesting presentation. I want to give the final word to Pablo to close this session. Pablo, are you there?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, sorry. No, just want to say thank you to Mittul for the lecture and the cases you shared with us. Indeed, I think all the cases also from different countries are very valuable. Thank you, Galyna, and thank you everybody for joining us today. This lecture, as all other lectures, will be available both on the website of postconflictrecovery.org and on a YouTube channel of Global Urban Lab. So you can rewatch it or share it with your friends. The topic for the next lecture will be the circularity of the built environment, systemic perspective by Dr. Alexander Vandal from TU Delft. He will be assisted by Roman Pushkin, co-founder and CEO of Rethink. It's also a Ukrainian colleague. So the topic is, of course, ubiquitous, especially in the recent years, but our speakers will discuss the major gaps of this strategy. Once again, thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you to our lecturers, and good luck.
Thank you very much, and see you all next week.